What is the best way to control your stance in tactical shooters?
The year is 1999. The Cold War has been over for more than a decade.
Hey guys, Tuan here. This video is intended for you younger players out there who are new to the genre and still in the process of figuring out which control schemes suit your playstyle the best. I hope this video will assist you in making an informed decision, but I'm just another player, far from a subject matter expert, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Speaking of salt, if you're an older player like me and you just wanted to listen to me babbling on a niche topic, then you are also most welcome to stay. In any case, I'll be using examples from the late 1990s to the mid-2000s. And as always, feel free to use the provided timestamps to jump to the relevant segments. When it comes to choosing between stance control systems, our options as players are limited to only what the game developers made accessible in their game settings. Because even if the key bindings are fully configurable, the available control systems themselves are almost always hard-coded, so to speak. But if we're lucky enough to be offered multiple options in the controls menu, then for the vast majority of us older players, the best stance control mechanic is the one we're most comfortable with. Now that could mean different things to different players, meaning no single universal mechanic will be able to satisfactorily fulfill the unique needs of every individual player. So the best case scenario we can hope for is for the game developers to provide a reasonable number of options that can be further personalized to cater to each player. This video is by no means a comprehensive list of every available stance control mechanic, but the select few covered in this video all have unique advantages to offer, making each one of them worth including into any good tactical shooter, in my opinion. With toggle crouch, you simply press the assigned button to toggle between crouching and standing. It is the superior option if you often find yourself needing to crouch for extended periods of time. This mechanic is common in titles without prone that either place heavy emphasis on CQB or are primarily focused on urban warfare. Notable examples of early tactical shooters that employed toggle crouch as default include the original Rainbow Six, its sequel Rogue Spear, and SWAT 3. SWAT 3 also had buttons dedicated to kneeling and standing, but we'll get back to that in a later section in this video. SWAT 4, while still offering toggle crouch as an option, had Momentary Crouch as its default method for kneeling. If you prefer stance adjustment to feel more responsive, then you're gonna want to get yourself accustomed to using Momentary Crouch. Also known as ducking, this mechanic was popularized by faster-paced and more action-oriented shooters, as players would be able to, if needed, cancel their crouch quicker and with only half the number of key presses that toggle crouch requires. The term momentary crouch is used here to avoid ambiguity because when people say hold to crouch, they usually mean holding down the crouch button to crouch, and releasing it will cause them to stand back up. Whereas when they say hold to prone, they really mean holding down the prone button long enough to activate toggle prone before releasing it without any consequence. This so-called hold to prone mechanic is usually integrated into the change stance function, which we'll cover in a later section. Unlike momentary crouch, the use of momentary prone is not as widespread, likely because if not executed properly, the process of transitioning from kneeling to prone or from prone to kneeling frequently causes players to unintentionally stand up, an action which could prove fatal or at least disastrous in a firefight. When both momentary crouch and momentary prone buttons are held, our character should assume the stance of whichever momentary button that was held latest, and then when one of the momentary buttons is released, the game should ensure that our stance is now that of the momentary button that is still being held. Toggle and momentary should not need to be mutually exclusive, but making them compatible can become problematic unless the following principles are applied. If a momentary stance button is being held, pressing a toggle button should do two things. Number 1, without making us stand, it should make us assume the stance of the pressed toggle button if we're not already in it. And number 2, it should render ineffectual the eventual release of the momentary button that was being held, meaning we should not stand up upon releasing the button. Furthermore, holding down a momentary button when you are already in the appropriate stance should not make you quote-unquote momentary stand. When a game does it correctly, it's not uncommon to hear about players utilizing combinations like Momentary Crouch with Toggle Prone. In SWAT 4, for instance, we could rebind Momentary Crouch to Control, and since we could not bind Toggle Crouch and Momentary Crouch together to the same key, at least not in this game, assign Toggle Crouch to C. Therefore, if we were expecting to take a knee for a longer duration, we now have the option to simply Toggle Crouch by pressing C, while still retaining our ability to Momentary Crouch by holding Control. Being able to even pull that off is commendable. However, the issue in SWAT 4 was, because it was not implemented properly, if you were already in the kneeling position and then you hold the Momentary Crouch button, you would momentary stand instead. That is, when you release the button, you would return to kneeling. This is literally the opposite of how Momentary Crouch is expected to function. An example of how it should have worked was in Viet Cong, wherein you could press the crouch button to toggle into the kneeling stance, and then if you hold a different button for momentary crouch, it would keep you crouched, and then only when you release the momentary button would you recover to standing. In fact, in Viet Cong, you could even press toggle crouch to toggle between kneeling and standing, and then hold the same exact button for momentary crouch, releasing it to recover to standing. Alright, now that we're done with momentary functions, let's move on to a more conventional system.
All units, this is Romeo 6-4. I read. I say again, I read. That's the launch code. Hang on, everyone. You heard it. I read. Man, I thought we'd never get to go for this operation. I was tired of getting all dressed up for nothing. I hear that.
Toggle Crouch and Toggle Prone has become the modern standard in virtually every tactical shooter with Prone on the PC platform today. And there's a good reason why. It just works.
All of this just works.
Pressing Toggle Crouch makes you kneel, but if you're already kneeling, it'll stand you up. Likewise, pressing Toggle Prone makes you go prone, but if you're already prone, it'll stand you up.
And again, it just works.
I highly recommend sticking with the tried and true toggle mechanic if you're looking for efficiency and economy of motion.
All units, this is Romeo 6-4. Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. Forward 2, Lucy, roger. Juliet 6-4, roger. Lucy. Uniform 6, Lucy, roger. Delta 5-9.
The year is 2008, and the world teeters on the brink of war.
If you prefer the controls of classic Tom Clancy games from the early 2000s, then the stance up, stance down mechanic needs no introduction. An important potential downside to factor in when you're considering this mechanic is that unlike toggle, going from standing to prone and vice versa are often considered by many to be inefficient, since players not only need to press the appropriate key twice, but also games with this mechanic often still animate our characters sequencing through the kneeling position instead of immediately diving to hit the deck, or immediately standing up, perhaps due to lacking the animations for direct transition. There were of course earlier iterations of this mechanic, such as in the first Hidden and Dangerous. However, that game cycles between the stances, meaning pressing stance up if you were already standing will make you go prone, and pressing stance down if you were already prone will make you stand up. So even though this allowed players to switch between standing and prone directly and with a single key press, in this particular instance, perhaps it would have been less confusing and more apt if the terms stance down and stance up were replaced with next stance and previous stance. And despite being adequately functional on a gamepad, raising and lowering your stance incrementally may not be the best option if you prefer to play with a controller. A gamepad has a significantly limited number of buttons, especially when compared to a keyboard and mouse setup. Therefore, button economy takes priority over efficiency and responsiveness. So while other stance control mechanics should remain applicable to a controller, adopting a single button configuration for stance control would be most optimal, as it accommodates more buttons to be allocated to other important functions. The change stance action functions as though toggle crouch and toggle prone were bound to a single button, except that in order to toggle prone, instead of just pressing the key, you now need to hold it, but only very briefly. The console-exclusive SOCOM series on the PS2 was probably the best example of this mechanic. Although the multi-platform Conflict series did feature change stance function, The way you'd stand up from prone in the first 3 games was essentially through toggle crouch, in that they required you to press the crouch button twice. It wasn't until Conflict Global Terror that the function of the change stance button would reproduce that of the PS2 SOCOM games, allowing the function to finally be experienced on the keyboard. Console shooters with prone typically assign the change stance function to the B button on the Xbox controller or the circle button on the PlayStation controller by default. Modern tactical shooters on the PC, with or without controller support, should allow players to rebind the change stance function to any button, including the ones on the keyboard, as well as the mouse. So if you want to keep the number of keys for stance control purposes to an absolute minimum, or if you are simply looking for a more controller-friendly alternative, then change stance is a godsend. If only the option was made available in more tactical shooters. On the other hand, if the number of easily accessible keys allocatable to stance control is not a concern, then you should definitely try GoToCrouch and GoToProne. GoToCrouch and GoToProne are dedicated one-way buttons that function exclusively to transition you into the specified stance. We'll be referring to them as such in order to distinguish them from toggle crouch and toggle prone. This is conceptually and practically the most straightforward stance control mechanic for anyone to understand and start using. Granted, that sentiment may be challenging to prove given the system's limited adoption. Admittedly, I myself am partial towards toggle because it's easy to stick with what's familiar and stay in your comfort zone. After all, if you're already used to doing something a certain way for decades, it would take a considerable amount of time and effort to reprogram your muscle memory with deliberate practice. This mechanic is as simple as it gets. Press GoToCrouch to crouch, press GoToProne to go prone, and press stand to stand up. We'll talk about the stand key in the next section, but what's important here is the consistency. Pressing GoToCrouch always makes you crouch, and pressing GoToProne always makes you go prone. As a result, dedicated stance buttons prevent you from unintentionally standing up. You don't have to worry about accidentally hitting the key twice or hitting the key by mistake, because either way, it won't toggle you out of the desired stance. You also don't have to hold the key down for any amount of time for any reason. So if you're a player who can appreciate a simple, consistent, and foolproof stance control system, then the dedicated stance keys are definitely worth giving a try. A couple of more recent shooters that you might want to get your hands on if you're interested to try out this mechanic include Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising and its sequel Red River. Well, if a tactical shooter offers the option of using dedicated stance keys, then naturally they must also provide a button to press to stand back up. This was the case for SWAT 3, Arma 1, and Arma 2, however in these games technically we were not able to jump. In order to prevent unrealistic behaviors like bunny hopping, it is very tempting for developers to take the easy route and outright omit jumping in its entirety. But navigating obstacles with one form of jumping or another is realistic. So completely disabling all forms of jumping certainly will not make a game more realistic. If anything, it will probably make it less realistic. There's varying opinions on what action should be taken, if any, when a player intentionally presses jump while they are crouched or prone, and this is reflected by different titles opting for different responses. Some actually made you jump, some did nothing, while others made you stand. Now everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but I think we can all agree that the best approach is to provide options, and a good example of this would be like the one in Squad. Alright, that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, or if you have any questions. If you found this video to be useful or informative, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. I'll see you in the next one.
Target acquired. Go, go, go!